Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. This week on De-Risky Business, we're bringing back our Tariff Tarot segment to try to make sense of President Trump's tariff threats against Colombia over the weekend.
And then we'll switch gears and zoom out to talk about the new administration's plans to ban Chinese IT goods and services from the U.S. market, including what it may do with Biden-era programs on connected vehicles and drones.
And then finally, we're joined by Stacie Pettyjohn, Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Program at CNAS, to discuss her research on emerging uses of drones in warfare, the U.S. defensive industrial base for drone production, and what she's learned flying drones in her backyard.
This podcast is supported in part by Amazon and through general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program.
All right, so Emily, before we get to our main discussion this week, I do think we need a quick game of Tariff Tarot. As listeners certainly know, this is our completely serious, not at all made-up framework for making sense of the various tariff warnings, threats, and pronunciations coming out of the Trump administration.
I think you're right, Geoff, and that's right. Tariff Tarot, completely predictive, will make everything clear in terms of how tariffs are going to unfold over the next hours, days, and months. So let's get into it. So what we wanted to talk about on Tariff Tarot today, of course, is the news that we saw over the weekend about a potential for 25% tariffs on Colombia.
Yeah, and, at the risk of mixing our card game metaphors here, I don't think anyone particularly had Colombia on their bingo cards as being the first country that's going to face Trump tariffs, but that's what we had to last week. So, Emily, what happened?
Yeah, so why are we even in the situation where tariffs were threatened? So over the weekend, there was a dispute between the U.S. government and the Colombian government over flights coming from the United States headed to Colombia with deported immigrants. Now, there's a little bit of context here, which is important, which is that the U.S. has been regularly sending commercial civilian flights to Colombia as part of its broader deportation program. The flights that were at issue over this weekend were military planes, so that has a little bit of a different characteristic. The Colombian president had also raised some concerns about the humane treatment of the individuals on these flights, and so kind of while the flights were up in the air, there was a moment where it seemed like the Colombian government was not going to allow the flights to land. And then pretty quickly, we saw President Trump come out and say that if the flights don't land, we're going to see a 25% tariff on imports from Colombia. Economically, this would be pretty substantial for Colombia, for U.S. consumers. That would mean things like, my enormous jug of coffee that I have every morning would all of a sudden get 25% more expensive. So
steep price to pay there. Yeah.
I mean, for everybody that works with me, I think that's probably right. Yeah. So it would certainly hit the trade relationship pretty substantially. Now, we were able to kind of walk back from this particular crisis. The flights landed, and the tariffs ultimately were not imposed. But I think that this incident tells us a lot about how the Trump team looks at first of all, handling geopolitical disputes, and then particularly how it views tariffs as a tool to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I think, what I really take away from this is that the Trump team, and again, I think not surprisingly to anyone who's been paying attention here, is going to be pretty quick on the trigger to impose new tariffs. That, as this crisis was going on, Trump sort of immediately took to Truth Social and kind of put out the statement that we're sort of immediately putting 25% tariffs on. They would go up to 50% tariffs in a week. Also talked about, full banking and financial sanctions on Colombia. Not entirely clear what that would have meant. But this was the real sort of full pressure approach. And I think it shows that, the Trump administration is not going to be shy or reticent at all to kind of turning up that maximum pressure and then seeing how countries respond to it.
That's right. I mean, this was not a prolonged policy process with principals meeting and debating options, right? This was a quick announcement, and candidly, I mean, in the short term at least, effective.
Yeah. Again, there's kind of some competing stories about, after the fact, both sides trying to say got out of this what we want. That sort of, maybe the sort of migrants that are being transited are not being transited on military planes anymore, although, again, the details here are a bit murky to me, at least. But it does seem, at least, if Trump ultimately wanted, to make sure these planes were able to go ahead, that he's getting what he wanted here. And at least at a basic level, it seems like Colombia did back down from the stand they were taking.
That's right. So I think we can expect to see more of this. I mean, bigger picture question, of course, if we actually have to impose and maintain these tariffs and they start to accumulate, maybe that does impact the thinking a little bit, at least on the U.S. side. But for now, in the short term, they're getting the results they want. So I think we're going to keep seeing it.
Yeah. And then again, just the longer term question, obviously everyone else in the world is going to look at this scenario and say, all right, does this just sort of raise the salience of dependency on the U.S. market as a big risk? I think, we're used to talking a lot about kind of de-risking from China. I think we're used to talking about kind of Chinese economic coercion and the threats that poses to countries that depend on the Chinese market. A lot of those same analyses may apply to countries who are dependent on the U.S. market, and it'll be interesting to see how they start thinking about that in the months and years ahead.
All right, so Geoff, if we're playing Tariff Tarot, what cards are you giving to the Colombia tariffs incident?
I don't know. This is where I'm, again, falling back on my lack of real tarot knowledge here. I will say, I do not think this was bluster. I think the Trump team was completely prepared to go through with this. I think they would have had the tariffs in place on Monday morning if the Colombians had not changed their policy. So this was a kind of real policy and would have had, some real impact in the United States, but certainly a big impact for Colombia.
Yeah, I agree. This does not get the bluster card, right? This was serious. This was credible. I would give it a out of left field card because I don't think this is one that any of us were anticipating, right? We've been talking about 60% tariffs on China. We've been talking about the North America tariffs. But I do think it really goes to the kind of the difficulty in predicting where tariffs would be applied if it's not just to deal with economic issues, right? We're now seeing this direct linkage between non-economic issues and an economic response through tariffs. So I think this one definitely gets the out of left field card and a credibility card for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So maybe just briefly before we wrap up this Tariff Tarot game, there is a bit more news on the tariff front we're tracking, which is that Trump has mentioned that tariffs on Canada and Mexico could be coming as soon as Saturday, February 1st. So we're recording this on Tuesday morning. Countdown is certainly on in both Ottawa and Mexico City. So Emily, what do you think? Is this a real threat that we will see tariffs this week on Canada and Mexico?
I'm going to punt on this one. Do I get a punt card? Can I do that?
Punt card, sure.
Like get out of jail free card? I think that the timing, obviously the timing matters for companies who are trying to comply with this. It certainly matters for the negotiation. I would say let's step away from the timing, though. I think tariffs on Canada and Mexico are going to happen at some point, right? I just think when you look at the America First trade policy review, they were clearly laying the groundwork in that initial executive memo coming out from the administration on day one that they are preparing seriously a range of options to impose tariffs in the North American context. Now, whether that's going to be a sustainable tariff policy, whether it's just trying to bolster the U.S. position as we head into USMCA renegotiations, right? I think there's some open questions there. I think it could happen this weekend, but if it doesn't happen this weekend, I don't think anybody should breathe a sigh of relief. I do think that there is, I give this one definitely a credibility card, and I think it is a high impact card as well.
Yeah, no, strongly agree on that. I think I saw some reporting saying that, Goldman Sachs was telling some of his clients, I think there's a 1 in 5 chance that tariffs are implemented on Saturday. So it seems, they are turning their tarot card, their tarot deck as well here. No one seems to really know. But agree, right? The kind of critical thing is not necessarily what day it is. It's sort of, is it next week? Is it next month? Is it 2 months from now? We'll see. If you are, a supplier in any of the 3 countries that depends on cross-border trade, you should be preparing that there will be tariffs in place. We don't know exactly when they are going to hit. But I strongly believe that tariffs are coming. And as you say, I think this is very much wrapped up in, we've been clear we're going to renegotiate the USMCA, and that this is kind of laying the groundwork and trying to shift that balance before those negotiations really kick off.
That's right. And last point before we move on to the rest of the episode, the U.S. isn't the only one that's preparing here, right? We know that Canada is preparing. We've heard from Trudeau, who clearly doesn't have a super strong negotiating position right now, but that they're preparing kind of a 1-for-1 tariff. Mexico is trying to put up a strong posture as well. So I think the other thing that seems clear is that there's going to be at least some level of retaliation, which is a pretty messy way to start a trade negotiation.
Yeah, exactly. Not the 3 amigos closest of friends here kicking off negotiations to start with. All right, so maybe let's wrap up Tariff Tarot there, and we'll move into discussion on drones and ICTS.
Yeah, let's do it. So we obviously have been spending a lot of time on this podcast thinking about and unpacking the various actions that we've seen come out of the Trump administration in the very early days. But there's one fairly important initiative that it looks like the Trump administration is largely going to keep in place. And this is the ICTS executive order. So this is the executive order that was first introduced in the first Trump administration that provided a new set of legal tools to restrict or ban the import of IT goods and services into the US market. It was really novel at the time. We had lots of ways to control exports, we had ways to control foreign investment in the US, but we didn't actually have a legal authority that would let us restrict, kind of on a broad market basis, the import of information communication technology and services, ICTS, if you want to go for the full acronym there. We didn't have a tool that would really regulate ICTS imports. That became a huge issue in the context of Huawei equipment being put into US networks. And then you can see how just more broadly across a highly digitized, highly connected economy where this would present some risks. So the Trump administration saw that the first time around. They implemented the executive order the first time around, and that is actually the basis for the program that we have today, which may explain why they're not particularly interested in rolling it back. So it was mentioned in the America First Trade policy memo as something that they're going to take a look at, but really take a look at it with an eye to continuing, expanding, and really just continuing to implement this program.
Yeah, exactly. I think, my read of how it's mentioned in that America First Trade policy memo is very much this is a kind of continuation of the policy that's been building up really over the last 5-6 years now that this order's been in place. I think, a lot of people, when this order first came out, I think, the broad sweeping nature of it was really quite amazing. As you're saying, Emily, it really captures basically any kind of connected device that is coming in from a foreign adversary. Again, focus on China and Russia, but kind of from any foreign adversary country, that poses a risk to U.S. national security. Kind of potentially is under scope of this executive order. So it's just an incredibly wide, kind of looking around the room that we're recording this podcast in right now, there's at least a dozen goods that could be blocked by this executive order.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And it's worth noting just for a second how much this program has really solidified and been institutionalized over the last 5 or 6 years. When the order first came out, there was this huge outcry from industry because of the broad scope, because no one was certain how these broad authorities were going to be used. Even the Commerce Department's initial assessment about the coverage of this order said that something like 4.5 million firms engage in ICTS covered transactions on a regular basis. So what an administrative nightmare that would be to try to have to regulate all of that. But what we've seen since the release of the initial order is a real program being stood up, right? So Commerce now has something like 40 to 50 professional staff who are implementing this program. We've seen a series of rulemakings come out about connected vehicles, which we've talked about on the podcast, about drones, which we're going to get into. And so we do see a really kind of solid living program now. To me, it makes a lot of sense that the Trump team would come in and say, yep, we started this, it's only gotten better. And so now the question is not do we keep it or do we get rid of it? It seems pretty clear they're going to keep it. But what do we do with this set of authorities?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe just one additional point on kind of how the office is built. We've been banging the drum on this podcast and other places a while on the need for the Bureau of Industry and Security to have more resources. It is worth sort of noting and kind of applauding Congress that this is the one area where there actually has been kind of real appropriation of new money is to stand up a proper ICTS office within BIS. And again, every kind of thing we see other Trump administration suggests that will continue. But the question is, with this massive scope, where will they take it? So should we talk a little bit about connected vehicles since that's the first one that has gone across the finish line so far?
We should talk about connected vehicles. I mean, this is really addressing the fears that our cars are all spying on us.
Yeah.
Which, sounds ridiculous.
Maybe true.
Maybe true. I don't know. I mean, who knows, right? My car's really old, so maybe I'm fine. But the basic idea is that there's chips, there's connectivity devices in your cars, and in the wrong hands, this could lead to collection of information. It could lead to cyber attacks that disable vehicles. There's a security risk there. Under the Biden administration, the Commerce Department did get that rulemaking to a final stage. So there is now a final rule regulating connected vehicles related imports. And this is the one area that the America First Trade Policy Review does call out specifically as they want to take a look at this. And that makes sense. It is the only final rule that is on the books when it comes to this type of program. So what do you think they're going to do with it?
My instinct is that, the Trump team will keep the connected vehicle rule pretty much in place. Again, I think if you look at the rulemaking that came out from the career staff at BIS here, it's clear that tons of work went into it, did a lot of the technical work to figure out what are the specific software and hardware components that pose the greatest risk, and highlighting these two risks of what they call data exfiltration, meaning kind of our cars spying on us and that data going back to China or elsewhere, as well as kind of remote access. Could a kind of malicious actor in China or elsewhere brick a car? Could they, kind of shut down access or sort of accelerate a car speed on the highway, whatever it could be. So there's been some kind of real good technical work to figure out what are the actual technical components that matter for these risks and how do we ensure they're not coming from untrustworthy sources. So I'd be surprised if they kind of come up with big changes to it, but we'll see.
And in a lot of ways, the connected vehicles restrictions are easier to implement. There's not a huge commercial impact for finished automobiles, at least, right? We don't have a lot of Chinese automobiles that are being sold in the American market. So in some ways, this is a preventative policy trying to get ahead of a future problem where if you had a lot of Chinese-made cars being driven in America, you could see more of a wide-scale problem because of these potential security risks. We don't have that today, and so they're trying to get ahead of it. And obviously, it's a little bit more complicated once you get into the parts and components aspect of the rule. A lot of that does actually come from China, so it's not to say that car makers aren't going to have to make some significant adjustments to comply, but in some respects, this is a lot easier than the other rule that we saw come out from Commerce in a draft phase, which is a rule about drones and commercial drones like DJI, etc. And this is going to be such a harder problem for the government to grapple with because the US doesn't really make a lot of drones and China makes a lot of drones. So we can put in place these restrictions, we can ban the drones, but then that means we don't have those drones coming into the US market.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really interesting. We have the ANPRM, the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, the kind of first stage in the rulemaking process on drones that came out under the Biden team. And reading through it, what they say is that basically the same concerns in connected vehicles are also present in drones. So it's, again, the national security risks tied to data filtration as well as tied to kind of remote access of these unmanned aerial vehicles, as they are technically called in the ANPRM. And so you'd imagine a kind of similar approach as what we saw in connected vehicles. But as you say, the kind of big issue here is that, Chinese drone companies dominate the U.S. market, dominate global markets. As the ANPRM kind of explicitly notes, probably about 75% of the drone market in the United States is from Chinese companies. So it's just a kind of fundamentally different kind of commercial question and really kind of political economy question of how this is going to play out. I think it's notable in the case of connected vehicles, there hasn't been too much pushback from here. I haven't heard from any stakeholders who are really sort of oh, we shouldn't be doing this at all. Obviously kind of China raises its diplomatic complaints as it always does. But by and large, sort of industry here, various stakeholders seem on board with this. The drone one, again, I think there's kind of agreement we need to do something here, but it's just going to be much, much harder when we have all of these kind of local police departments, let alone all of the kind of drone hobbyists at home who are currently buying these Chinese drones. Are we just going to tell them stop buying them? What happens then?
Right, or the drones that are being used in firefighting operations, right? I mean, that's certainly on everybody's mind right now in terms of, what's happening in LA. So it's a much harder problem set. We can put a pin in it for now because we do have our colleague Stacie Pettyjohn coming on for the next segment to talk much more extensively about drones and her research on drones in the military context and her thoughts on what the U.S. should be doing to build up the drone industrial base. But that will be the broader question about what to do with this drone rulemaking under the ICTS executive order is something that the Trump team will have a chance to put their own stamp on. The draft rule that came out on drones does have an open public comment period. So it's definitely a handoff from the Biden team to the Trump team, and then the Trump administration will have an opportunity to decide how it wants to shape that final rulemaking. But there's another aspect of ICTS EO that we should talk about, which is we've been talking about the restrictions on broad technology classes, but the executive order can also be used to put restrictions on particular companies. We saw one instance of this under the Biden administration, which was to restrict the importation of Kaspersky cybersecurity software. Kaspersky is a Russian company. Seems like fairly obvious that maybe we don't want a malicious Russian cybersecurity software being sold in the United States. So that was one that folks, who are familiar with this space kind of seemed like an obvious thing, and why did it take us so long to ban Kaspersky? But there's a bunch of other actions that we understand are pending with respect to particular companies, and we just haven't seen them pop out on the other side of the process.
Yes, there's long been kind of rumors and some reporting on sort of various Chinese telecommunications companies who generally have kind of minimal presence in the United States, but do have some real presence still. And, the question is, should the United States be kind of blocking these companies in the same way that they're sort of using this power to block Kaspersky? And again, it's kind of completely within the power of this executive order to do so. And why is that taken so long? Again, I don't have any definitive answers to this. These are kind of complicated legal questions. I know certainly when we look at the kind of full paperwork that came out with the Kaspersky decision, again, you saw how much staff time and resources went into that. Again, in my view, really trying to ensure this was legally airtight, that, a challenge under this new authority would hold up to scrutiny here. So I don't know if that's partially still what's going on with these Chinese companies. There are also kind of other authorities the United States have from FCC and other bodies that are kind of maybe having a similar purpose. But there is this kind of underlying question, which again, this EO is this huge power that can be used to point at either any given kind of sector of the economy or any given kind of particular Chinese company involved in ICTS in any way, and really kind of, blow things up. So remains to be seen if the Trump administration chooses to use this in a much broader scope than the Biden team did.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to see what they choose to do with the particular company restrictions that they could implement under the executive order. My sense is that there's going to be interest in picking up some of those investigations and moving them to conclusion. I think the Trump team is more comfortable assuming a bit of litigation risk. I mean, anytime you're taking action against a specific company, you have to assume that there's higher litigation risk. Of course, that company is going to sue if you tell them they can't access the U.S. market, right? But I do think that the Trump team is going to be more open to that. And then we'll see what else they want to do on the broader technology class restrictions, right, along drones and the connected vehicles. Now, there's an important constraint on this authority that we should mention at least briefly. It did come up in the first Trump administration, which is that the ICTS executive order, because it is based on IEPA, so the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it does have an important constraint that is baked into IEPA, which is that the executive order cannot be used to regulate the direct or indirect flow of communications or informational materials. This is basically a First Amendment issue. And the initial Trump administration ran into trouble when they tried to use the ICTS executive order to ban Chinese social media apps. And that quickly ran into trouble in the courts, with courts in a couple of different instances coming back with rulings saying that because of the way that the restrictions were set up, that the government actually could not use this particular set of authorities to ban social media apps in the US market. That's part of the reason why when we're talking about TikTok now, what they're actually trying to do is force a divestment. They're using a different set of legal authorities because they tried to do it under ICTSEO and they can't.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is the Berman Amendment, and we're talking here again, it's kind of interesting long congressional history here, which just kind of dates back to some sort of U.S.-Soviet kind of relations and, the interest in ensuring that we are not restricting, as you said, kind of free speech and open speech between kind of open and closed societies at the time. But has had this funny kind of follow-on effect that this Berman Amendment still being on the books tied to IEPA, if the IEPA authority is what the United States government is acting under as the ICTSEO is structured, it means you kind of have this, one real guardrail on what it can be used, which is that it cannot cover this information materials. So certainly that was definitive in the TikTok kind of case. Also came up a little bit in the context of the data security executive order. If you look at that, which is also under IEPA authorities, it is structured in a way that is not kind of run afoul of the Berman Amendment. But I think there is a, this is sort of in the weeds of specific things. There's a bigger question here, which gets at the interplay between congressional authorities and executive authorities, and also the ability of Congress to impose guardrails on these authorities when it wants to, right? So the Berman Amendment is one of the kind of few ways where Congress has said we're going to limit what IEPA can be used for. I think it's a good and open debate we should have of whether kind of the Berman Amendment makes sense, how you might want to change it, but is also an example of like, there are other things you could imagine Congress would put in, sort of, future amendments that maybe would restrict IEPA in certain ways. And, as we've been talking about and we'll be talking about, I think the Trump administration will be kind of pushing the limits of where IEPA can be used and may kind of spark more questions on what guardrails are needed.
Yeah, and just to keep with the zooming out here, it's a great point, right? What is Congress's role here, and how do they want to shape the executive branch's use of these types of authorities? But there's also this still huge question that we have in American society about what's this balance between national security and free speech. The TikTok case that reached the Supreme Court and is not over yet is a important data point. But we also have this broader question of, what are the privacy rights that we should have on social media platforms, and how does the national security dynamic play into all of that, right? So I think that's going to continue to be an important policy area to watch. And even if the TikTok, switching gears from the ICTS EO, switching to TikTok, even if that specific case is resolved, we still have this bigger picture question of like, well, what's the next TikTok, and how do we make sure that we have our legal and regulatory framework in place to be able to respond more quickly, more nimbly. We can't use the ICTS executive order. We probably don't want to have an act of Congress every single time there's a new Chinese social media company or tech company that becomes big. Like, what are we going to do about DeepSeek?
Yeah. Wow. DeepSeek's a terrific question here. I will say, so the TikTok law that passed is structured in a way to allow additional social media platforms to be designated by the president as posing national security risks. So they did sort of start to build some of that into the legislation, but I think still real questions sort of the process of how that will actually happen. And DeepSeek is a whole other issue. I think it would not qualify under that law as I read it. So who knows what's going to happen there.
I think that was the punt card.
Always happy to go to the punt card.
All right. Well, lots to continue to watch in this space, and let's go ahead and get Stacie Pettyjohn on the podcast to talk about her work on drones and the military context. So we are delighted to be joined today on De-Risky Business by Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn. So Stacie is Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS. She is an expert, among other things, on drones and how drones are changing the character of war. Her two excellent recent reports on drone warfare are linked in the show notes. Highly recommend that folks check that out. So Stacie, welcome to De-Risky Business.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Stacie, when did you start getting interested in drones? Like, why is this an interesting research question for you as a defense analyst?
I have been interested in drones for a while. I worked at the RAND Corporation for a long time and did a lot of work for the Air Force there, and was interested in airplanes in general and then drones in particular. And then we started to see, like in 2019, 2020, there were these stories about what was going on in Libya, that it was the biggest drone war in the world, and that there were Chinese drones fighting Turkish drones, and it was just this revolution. And then the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan kicked off in 2020 over Nagorno-Karabakh, and there was more hype about drones and how decisive they were, and then of course Ukraine. And even when I was at RAND, before some of those conflicts had begun and I had moved over to CNAS, I had encouraged the Air Force to look at some of the recent uses of these new technologies, because they can learn a lot from how other countries have employed these weapons and what effect they might have in different circumstances, even if they're very different. So that's where my interest stemmed from. I'm a nerd.
I mean, you're in the right place then. Yeah. So you just mentioned a little bit some of the kind of hype around drones and how it's sort of revolutionizing warfare. However, in some of your recent reports, you talk about, particularly in the Ukraine conflict, you describe it as an evolution, not a revolution, in how war are being fought. So can you explain a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is a contentious issue and somewhat of an academic one, but I think it is important because there are a whole cadre of people who are technology enthusiasts and think that they're going to solve all your problems, or that it is going to just fundamentally change warfare. And there's a whole literature on a revolution in military affairs and what constitutes that. And from my perspective, what has happened in Ukraine has not constituted a revolution in military affairs for a number of reasons. One, it hasn't provided a decisive edge to either side. Both sides are using drones. They're both incredibly important, and they provide different capabilities that neither had. They've been critical in sort of shoring up some of Ukraine's conventional military weapons deficiencies and shortfalls, especially like artillery ammunition, but they're not substitutes. So normally when you think about a revolution in military affairs, you think of how precision-guided weapons and stealth and what happened in the Gulf War, and it provided this advantage that obviated past ways of fighting, and you don't see that with this thus far. I think that could change in the future as drones are more networked and information is passed more broadly. But right now at Ukraine, it's very tactical levels that drones are most dense and that they're having the biggest impact. And that's, within the 10 to 20 kilometers from the front line. So that's important, but it hasn't allowed either side to win. The other fact is that it ultimately needs to be fully incorporated into organizational structures and military doctrine and operational concepts. And you're seeing some of that where Ukraine created a drone service, but it's still in pretty nascent stages. So you have to have like this full institutionalization of the new capability, and then it really sort of means that if you have this capability and you're employing it in the right way, that you should win.
Great. So, another follow-up question maybe, can you talk a bit more about what kinds of drones are being used on the battlefield? Are these the same things anyone can kind of go on Amazon and buy today, or sort of how different are battlefield drones from commercial drones?
They're both. So there's so many different drones, and they are some of the ones you can buy on Amazon. Now, if you live in the DC area, you can't take them out in your backyard and fly them, as I found out, because everything is geofenced. I could fly it in my basement, but not in my backyard.
Oh, wow.
And,
fascinating.
Yeah, it wasn't. There was a learning experience, but and they're largely Chinese commercially made drones. Like DJI is the most prevalent company, and the most common drone on the battlefield in Ukraine is probably still the DJI Mavic 3, though the exact drone has changed over time, and there's been an increasing preference for drones with thermal cameras and some of the bigger ones. There are also military drones, so ones that are created specifically for the military use that typically have additional features that make them more survivable, more resistant to jamming, harder, are actually built in a way that they can carry ammunition and drop it, where all the DJI drones or the commercial drones that both sides have been using, they've had to customize. They take them, they hack into them so that DJI can't actually control them and identify where they're operating from. They have to adapt them so that they can carry ammunition. They make their own sort of, MacGyvered munition that they put on there, often with fins that are 3D printed, and then figure out how to drop ammunition on their own. Though in reality, most of the drones, and well, that's not true anymore. When I wrote my first report, most of the drones were generally used for surveillance, the commercial ones, the quadcopters, and they still are. But the first-person view kamikaze drones, the small racing quadcopters that crash into a target and carry some sort of explosive, have become the most prevalent drone, and they're making, Ukraine made more than 1 million of them, but they're not all the same. When I was in Kyiv and talking to some different folks, they dismissively called a lot of the drones that they got from the Ministry of Defense hamburger drones. They were mass produced and not very good quality, and that they didn't work very well, and those would only go like a kilometer or two and could be easily countered. But a lot of the units have their own sort of drone workshop on the backside that builds drones for them and customizes them, and they would place orders, just-in-time orders, like a week ahead of a mission, that allowed the drones to be configured to operate against the threat that they were seeing then, especially in terms of jamming.
That's fascinating. Have you seen any evidence that the Ukrainian side is having trouble getting the Chinese commercial drones? And I'm particularly asking because you see all of this reporting around Chinese support of Russia and how that's a problem, particularly in the microelectronics space. But are they essentially feeding both sides if all the commercial drones from China are also going to Ukraine?
From the last that I've heard, and I was there in the fall, they haven't had any trouble. And China's announced several times that they were going to cut off drones to both sides, and they've seen no effect on the battlefield. And then there hasn't been any trouble getting Chinese subcomponents, because a lot of the drones, the FPV ones in particular, they're making the airframes, but they rely especially on the Chinese electronics, on the cameras, on the gimbal, on the different things to make them effective. And there has been a movement by a lot of the Ukrainian companies to try to find alternate sources, but it inevitably ends up being more expensive. If you look at Thailand, Mexico, any of the other suppliers, you're looking at a significantly greater cost. And some are making those investments because they really do want the potential to eventually maybe sell their product more broadly within NATO to other countries. They want something that's going to be more survivable and high quality. But if you're just looking for the hamburger drones, I think a lot of them are assembled from Chinese subcomponents.
I feel like we're going to go into Stacie's office and find like a little drone workshop under her
Yeah,
desk.
exactly. A little artisanal drone making. This is great.
It's in her basement. The listeners can't see this, but her eyes are just like lighting up. I want to switch gears a little bit to a different type of conflict, which is you've also written about potential future conflicts and use of drones in a Taiwan contingencies. So talk to us a little bit about how you see drones potentially, particularly the commercial drones, but I guess any type of drone as well. How will that technology matter in the event of a Taiwan contingency, including one where the U.S. military is engaged?
Yes. So obviously Ukraine is very different from the Indo-Pacific. One theater is a ground one where you have a land combat that is much more positional and fixed right now. And then the Indo-Pacific, there's, little islands, they're pretty far away from each other. So I think that the type of drones that the American military needs in that situation are very different than the ones that have been used in Ukraine. And the commercial quadcopters aren't going to be as helpful. There are ideas out there for deploying smaller drones, but I think the time on target, like getting them there and synchronizing them with other operations, would be really, really difficult for the U.S. with the distances, and you're going to tie up other assets, whether it's a bomber or a cargo aircraft or a ship, still has to put itself at risk to deliver tiny drones that don't have much range or endurance on their own. So I'm skeptical that would work, especially when China is much closer to Taiwan and could just, hold its forces back a little bit and wait until their batteries die and then go do whatever it needs to do. Exactly. But I do think Taiwan could make use of small quadcopters to use as artillery spotters like the Ukrainians and the Russians had. That would make their ground-based fires much more effective, kill zones. If there's an amphibious landing or an airborne assault, I would want to have small drones. I'd want to have FPVs too, because they can maneuver, and there is a psychological impact. I don't know how you measure this or see it, but when you have, artillery coming down on you, and then there's crazy, the drones are watching all the time. One of the hardest types of operations is an amphibious landing that's contested, and doing it against precision weapons, and drones knowing that you're being watched and things are coming at you and you have nowhere to hide and you're supposed to reassemble and get your equipment. It seems like it would be terrifying, and that would significantly help them to deter the Chinese from trying to ever undertake that. Unfortunately, China could also use some of those with its landing forces in similar ways. And China can also make use of a lot of shorter range military drones and deny Taiwan and the United States the ability to use their commercial drones or their subcomponents. On the military side, I do think there is a push with some of the efforts that you see in the Department of Defense to incorporate more commercial off-the-shelf technology in cheaper drones or missiles, but not Chinese-made.
Yeah, preferably, right?
Yeah. Preferably. We try to frown upon that.
Yeah. Frown, but do we have effective policy to prevent it? Different question, right? So, yeah. One of the things you talk about in your recommendations is this idea of resilience through reconstitution. And if I'm understanding that right, it's basically for some of these types of drones and some of these types of conflicts, you just need to be able to produce a lot of them. how is the U.S. prepared for that? And that is obviously like a leading question, because I think your answer is, well, we're just not.
Yeah, we're not prepared, and Taiwan's not prepared, unfortunately, and both are supposedly taking steps to rectify it, but there is a really steep sort of curve that they're going to have to overcome to actually be able to produce this type of drones, just given China's dominance of this market. And China had gotten an early foothold here, and I mean, DJI wasn't the first company, but I think their drones, which were just really easy to use, and with the Phantom series, they really sort of established themselves in the commercial market as the leader, and then were able to capitalize on it. They've invested a lot in improving the technology. It's vertically integrated now, so they build all the subcomponents that they need. They have huge economies of scale because they have like 75% of the world market, and they're producing really good products that are easy to use and really effective. And soldiers in Ukraine will say, like, the American systems are hard to use and not as good. And so that's a problem. And this is why I think you're starting to see, and you're going to have to see, an effort to actually foster the drone industry in the United States or Taiwan or anywhere else if they're going to compete with China at all, because you're not going to, the left to market sort of forces on their own. I don't think any company is going to break in right now and be able to do better than some of the Chinese companies.
Yeah, I mean, the point about kind of the soup to nuts kind of supply chain for the drones is also important, right? Because when you look at some of the recent retaliation that China has engaged in against U.S. companies, you immediately think of like Skydio. They don't have batteries because the batteries are Chinese made. So if we don't have that complete package available either through domestic sources or allied sources, like we're not going to solve that problem. And then we still have to worry about the cost problem.
Yep.
So I want to kind of bring this discussion back to what we were talking about separately in this episode, which is the proposal from the Commerce Department to introduce a ban or at least some restrictions on Chinese drones entering the U.S. market. So, we talked about sort of DJI, the key big player here, something like 75% of the U.S. market. As we think about what might the United States look like without Chinese drones in it, kind of what's that image, and maybe, coming from a defense background, national security background, what advice would you have for the Commerce Department as they think about how they want to structure these restrictions?
Sure. So I think what you're seeing and why this is a critical moment is drones are becoming increasingly important in a number of different industries and for a number of different reasons. You have hobbyists that use them for racing or for photography. DJI is now making these small drones that are really micro drones to take selfies. So they're playing in like the social media.
New selfie stick.
Wait, yeah. Do you then post it on TikTok? Do we have like the full cycle?
Yeah.
Exactly. And like the agricultural industry, they're really a cheaper way to spray your crops and to help tend to them. More generally, broader industry that sometimes has dangerous components. You can send a drone in to go to a really high point to look at different systems and make sure things are working right. And then first responders. And this is where I think you're seeing that there are legitimate security concerns across the board, though sometimes overblown. But the police, firefighters, and are using drones in various ways. You're increasingly, I think, going to see different private companies using drones for delivery of small packages. And so there is a concern that drones either could be hacked into by China, that they're collecting all the data on them and they're going to use it for espionage, and that they could either attack or try to covertly sabotage different types of critical infrastructure in the U.S. I think the bigger concern in some ways for me would be that they ground all the drones, they turn them off, because unless you hack into it, which you can do, but I doubt that everyone who has a DJI drone is, going through the steps of hacking into it so it's not connected to DJI and getting updates anymore. If they geofence everything, they could turn off drones that suddenly are an integral part of police or fire operations, and sort of incapacitate different parts of industry, which could be concerning and be something that would be hard to deal with, especially if you were in a moment of crisis, and cause a lot of fear. I think the broader concern at sort of a macro level is what you're talking about, where you want to do you want to be entirely dependent on one country for something that is increasingly important in a range of different industries and defense applications, but not just defense? And I think that that's where suddenly there's this realization that we've just gone with the best, cheapest option, and that maybe we need to have a sovereign or allied capability that we don't have as many concerns about not being available when we need them or want them.
Yeah, so maybe picking up on that, obviously we've got this idea of, all right, we could ban Chinese drones from entering the market. Next question is like, all right, what then, right? Like, where is the new source of supply going to come from? Is it realistic to think there will be kind of widespread manufacturing in the United States? Can we kind of build up our drone industrial base here or with close allies? Or what do you see as the path forward there for actually kind of, not just restricting the Chinese drones, but also the sort of positive affirmative side of building up our own industry?
I suspect that to really compete with China, but I don't know this for sure, and economics is not my area, that's you all, is you're going to need to have a collective demand. But one of the ways that I know the Drone Act that's under consideration that Representative Stefanik had put forward was to not immediately prohibit all DJI drones, because that would take away a capability that a lot of local law enforcement and first responders rely on, but instead to prevent them from buying the next generation of drones and prohibit that. And if anyone did buy DJI drones, for there to be a tax that essentially would be funneled back into American drone industry or subcomponents to help support that and to help build that up. So tariffs?
Everything comes back to tariffs. It's like
Back
we
to
can't
tariffs.
escape it.
But I'm not sure. I mean, there might be alternate ways to do it, but this is not in my area. I don't know what it is. It does seem like you're going to have to do something to bolster the industry if you really want to have it in the U.S. to subsidize it, because it's not going to be able to make it on its own.
Yeah, because I mean, another option that you could think about is, can you let the hardware come in but somehow address the software? But that doesn't actually, so that it can't be remotely hacked into. But I would suspect that just given how many drones are in operation and the volume of trying to do that technically would be quite complicated. Yeah. Also not a cyber expert. We should also say we're not economists, so I don't know what we're doing with this podcast.
You know more about it than I do, for sure. And I think, hacking and changing the software doesn't stop the supply problem either in the future, where if you're in a conflict or, China has a tendency to cut off the supply of things to any country that it is displeased with for various reasons, that you could just find yourself, no drones for you.
No drones for you. Stacie, we also have to ask you, moving to a different subject slightly, which is what is going on with all the drones in New Jersey? I know you did a lot of press engagement around this. Are we being invaded by aliens? What's happening here?
No, we're not. Though at least 3 members of my team, actually, which you all know is not that large, are from New Jersey, New York area. So they have had to relay some of the things that I've said to family members who there's a general alarm. I think this has just gotten really overblown. My suspicion is, and I don't know this for a fact, is that there were some drones flying over what would be considered restricted airspace or sensitive locations like Piccadilly and different military bases. And then people sort of started seeing drones everywhere, particularly in flight paths over major airports in the area. They kept seeing lights in the sky, and that they weren't really drones. There probably were some additional drones that some people were just flying. I don't know if they were nefarious. I don't know if they were linked. I doubt it. In all likelihood, this was just general hysteria that kind of perhaps one could say people from New Jersey might be prone to. That there has been a history of this, and that they got overly alarmed. I do think it is important to point out, however, that this is a moment where I don't think there was a critical security concern for the good folks of New Jersey, but there could be in the future, and that there are a lot of things that the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Aviation Administration should be doing right now to figure out what happens if these incidents occur and how they respond. And a lot of it is procedural. It doesn't even have to be capabilities. We're not going to obviously shoot things out of the sky here. That's not legal, and we don't want people with guns just shooting into the air, because that's probably going to end badly. But knowing what your authorities are at different bases have different are allowed to do different things to defend themselves. Who do they call in the FAA? Who do they call in Homeland Security? How do they respond? And do so in a transparent way so you don't end up in another moment of panic in the future, but also you're able to stop any drones which may be used by folks who are trying to conduct espionage operations. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, I mean, just zooming out, kind of digesting everything that you've said, it seems like we've got this one rule that we've been focused on in our little world of economic security around import of these commercial Chinese drones, but like the policy-making space to figure out what the U.S. does on drones is so much bigger. There's the industrial base components that we've talked about. There's everything here around, well, what do we do if there's drones in the sky? What do I do if an Amazon drone shows up at my doorstep, which is probably going to happen at some point, right? Like, how do we think about the privacy concerns, the security concerns? Like, there's a lot of policy making that still needs to happen around drones writ large, and this one particular rule from the Commerce Department is kind of a drop in the bucket.
But an important one, potentially, for figuring out how, it doesn't solve all the problems. You're absolutely right. It's a huge policy issue, but could help to mitigate some of the concerns about reliance and the abundance of Chinese drones in the U.S.
Great. So finally, Stacie, to close out, we like to ask all of our guests for a book recommendation, a podcast, a magazine article you're reading. What should De-Risky Business listeners be paying attention to get smart on drones, or just more generally ideas that you've liked recently?
This is probably not going to be a book that actually would appeal to many of your readers because it's fairly dense, but it is really well done. Jack Watling has a recent book called The Arms of the Future that draws a lot on what he's learned in Ukraine and through other research. It's focused particularly on ground combat, but there's a huge emphasis on the role that drones are playing in transforming things in an evolutionary, not a revolutionary fashion thus far. And he thinks through sort of what those implications might be and how you might realize sort of the full revolution in the future.
Awesome. This was super interesting for our listeners. We will link to Stacie's drones reports in the show notes. Do check them out. They're super well done. Stacie, thanks for joining us.
For having me.
Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.